Well, hello, and thank you all for joining us for another live episode of Teachers for Teachers. I'm Dr. Dejana, and I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Leah.
Hello, Dr. Dejana. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited about today's conversation, and I know I get excited about a lot of them, but I've listened to board member Nick Melvoin talk at the LA Chamber a couple of times, and have met him at a couple of different educational conferences. And he's a teacher, and he brings that to the experience, and he brings a lot of enthusiasm. And so, yeah, he's going to join us in a few minutes, and I think we'll have a really interesting and productive conversation.
I mean, I'm super excited about this. What a treat. We get a actual board member from one of our, the second largest unified school district in the United States, LAUSD, to come share with us, especially as we're wrapping up this school year and we're reflecting and planning and thinking about what's going to happen, next when it comes to education. So why don't I just introduce the panel again so that we can all get familiar with who's in the Zoom space, and we'll go from there. First up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Riddle. Go ahead and say hello, Mark.
Glad to see the panel again today.
Oh, wonderful. Mark is joining us, and he has degrees in music, theology, sociology, and works at West Coast University. Mark is a local living in Los Angeles as well. Next up, we have Dr. Marcela Klein Williams. Go ahead and say hello.
Hi, everybody. Good to have everyone here today.
An accomplished leader in education and well-known both in formal and informal learning environments, Dr. Williams is a frequent speaker on issues of equity. She's currently the STEM director of Oxnard College. And also welcoming to the panel, Anne McMullen. Go ahead and say hello, Anne.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you today. Thank you, Dejana.
Anne is also an accomplished and respected education consultant. She's based in Los Angeles and is the project director of COSIN's Empowered Superintendents Program. Additionally, the author of Life Lessons in Leadership. There you have it, Leah. Our amazing panel and our amazing team. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. And just, as a little bit of a precursor while we wait for Nick to join us, the last conversation I had with him about education was just about a month and a half ago. And we were talking about the transition back to in class, and of course all the complications that go along with it. And I can't even imagine when you're responsible for that many children, because just our own personal, okay, the CDC is saying this, but the county's saying this, and the city's saying that, and the number of considerations that they have to keep in mind in terms of running a district and getting them back. But his comments about the need to consider that some children have really done well in distance learning. And so how do we honor that group and move forward? And he had some really interesting ideas. Marcela, what are they doing at college? What are they doing at your school?
I think it's interesting that you say that, Leah, is that we found the same thing is for some of our students, and just for those of us to understand, one of the zip codes hardest hit by the pandemic is 93033. At one point, it had a rate higher even than Los Angeles during some of the darkest days of the pandemic, in how many people were coming down with COVID and simply dying from it as well. So as we look to come back, it was not just getting sick, but it was economic fallout. For many of the students, being online was successful. And I can understand nervousness of having a year like that, of wanting to remain online and have the ability, especially if it's asynchronous, to do it when they're available. The other piece that came out is many of our students are second language learners as well. So with the lecture, instead of hearing it once, hey, I missed that part, it's gone, they could go back and re-listen to the lecture to pick up those pieces that they missed along the way. So we got to leapfrog forward on what's possible in utilizing technology, and also this awareness that all learners are different and they have different needs. As educators, how do we meet them instead of how do they meet us instead? So yeah, that's a challenge.
I think one of the things that we've learned is that even students' awareness of their situations changes over time. We did a kind of a snap tally, a quick survey about a month into COVID, and there was just all kinds of disappointment about, not being able to be in the ground classes and see friends and whatnot. We've done subsequent surveys now, and the most recent one, so many students are looking for more of our classes to go online or have larger online components because they've found, they've found that equilibrium or the momentum, and have found that, they actually can do a lot of this stuff at home instead of spending so much time on Southern California freeways.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. The need for the students to be able to watch again the lectures. When I was in my PhD program, I did an audio record of every class I was in because I wanted to be able to do exactly that. And our guest is here, Nick Melvoin, School Board Member for LAUSD. Welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I apologize for being late. My only excuse was I was out of school. So, who can hold that against me?
Exactly. And boy, traffic is almost back to what pre-pandemic traffic looked like in the hours just before and just after school opens too. So not a problem at all, Nick. But I hope you got a chance to read who our guests are, our panel of regulars. I did send over a brief intro. So we did that in your absence, and then we were basically just talking about you. And there was a lot of trash talk here, Nick, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm used to it. Politics, nasty business. So.
Oh my God.
Well, you have a room full of fans today, and I was just talking a little bit about the conversations that we were having around the LA Chamber meeting regarding what's going on as we come back. And I know, but Dejana, why don't I pass it to you to say hi to Nick and go ahead and ask, because you had some very good questions too.
Awesome, cool. I love it when you just caught it. caught that one 100%. Well, Nick, thank you so much for being here. And I think I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for your service. Thank you for your service and leadership, helping our schools, our communities, our teachers, our students navigate the changes, challenges, and successful lots of pivots this year. So I wanted to start off with look, we're all in it, and thank you for rolling up your sleeves and just all right, diving in. One of the things that I did while I was preparing for this little panel, this conversation, is I started following you on Twitter. And, that's when you can really get to know a little bit about somebody on a different level, is just tap into their social media. No, I wasn't stalking, just a little tap. Little tap. And one of the things you recently tweeted that I thought was really interesting, and I'd love for you to elaborate here, was one thing that the pandemic had revealed to us as educators, we're all educators in the room here, is that there were parts of the education system that just weren't working well for many students. And it gave us the opportunity to examine these parts and kind of learn, okay, why isn't this working, and what type of innovative processes can we engage to address them? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Yes, we managed to get through. We're looking at the end. School's about to end. We're going to wrap it up. We're going to start next year. But what have we learned? What has the pandemic revealed to us about our education system? What have we learned? And what do you think about how we move forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, it's a pleasure to be joined by this panel of educators, and thanks for having me, and thanks for all the work that you're doing as well. I think you probably know my recent Twitter feed better than I do, but I will say that I think there are a few things. One is related to actually those immediate days and weeks after we close schools. And it was what we were really focused on as a district. And the first, it was kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the triage that we went to as a district, like the educational needs of kids and families was like 4 or 5 on the list, not because we don't care immensely about that, but because we're a district where over 82% of our kids are living in poverty. We had hundreds of thousands of kids who were relying on the school district for not just 1, but 2 or 3 meals a day. And so when I think back to that time 15 months ago, 14 months ago, it was all around, we closed schools on a Friday, and by Wednesday we were running what became the largest school-based food relief effort in American history. We, after then, launched these food distribution centers. We went and we procured $100 million worth of computers, laptops. We basically bought every iPad in the state of California. We created a contract with Verizon, which became the basis of a nationwide contract for school districts, for hotspots. And so I think to your question, Dr. Figueroa, I mean, one thing is just that schools are no longer just focused on the 3 R's, that schools are the social safety net of last resort. And at a time when other elements of the social safety net around mental health, around food security, around housing, the district has actually built housing for employees and low-income families on our land. Wow. That like, we're just, that school districts are school districts plus. And so I think that's one thing that this has really highlighted and made us think creatively and inclusively. What should a school district do? What are we equipped to do? But then how do we need to get funded to do this as well? And an exciting partnership that I've been working on is we are in the fall going to have a lawyer that we're embedding in a community of schools to help families with wage theft, eviction protection, immigration, guardianship, all these things that are not directly related to a kid's education, but tangential. Obviously, if you get evicted, it's going to affect your performance in school. If your somebody gets deported. And so this is one example where we've partnered with some legal aid organizations to come together and say, let's, as part of the school district's offering to families, have legal services. And that's not something that I think people will think is the core function of elementary school, but when we actually look at what's important to kids and their educational ecosystem, that's one of them. So I think there's that whole bucket. And then I think the second bucket is, folks are talking about learning loss and summer slide and, kids have been behind, so they're not doing well. Well, newsflash, only 30% of LA Unified's kids were proficient in math in 2019, pre-pandemic. Kids were losing ground in the summer because wealthy kids had opportunities for engagement and enrichment in summer school, and lower income kids didn't pre-pandemic. So I think that it's an opportunity to say, okay, with this unprecedented amount of cash we're getting, and that is one of the inflection points there. We are getting a huge infusion of resources from the federal government and from the state. Let's just not do more. Let's do different. Let's do better. And does that mean different types of summer school programs? Does that mean a longer school day? Does that mean we can finally reinvest in arts and music and things that are the first on the chopping block in times of recession, but we know are not only so important to kids' self-awareness, but also math scores go up when kids have access to arts. So I think that's one. And then the last one, relevant to the work I know that you all do is just that we have accelerated getting kids devices and access to the internet and thinking differently about technology. And I think as we try to catch kids up and trim the fat, if you will, by saying, okay, how do we take out what's essential and really make sure kids are getting the education they need? It can help us think about, well, how can we also add more to the way we're educating kids? I think that we are behind the rest of the world in high school. I think high school, I think there are some innovative schools that are doing it in this country, but really around the world, like by the end of in 9th and 10th grade, you can get kids core competencies. And then 11th and 12th grade, you could do project-based learning and dual enrollment and certificates and like all these self-guided coursework. And I think we need to really reimagine high school in particular. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last year.
I love it. Thank you. That was a thorough answer to my question. Some highlights that I pulled out from that is the realization that schools are more than just schools. I think we all realize that. Parents, teacher, like everybody realized that it's not just about reading and math. They basically are social safety nets for our entire system. You also did a really cool comparison to ecosystems. So my PhD is in marine biology, and I studied ecosystem management in marine environments. And it's really cool to think about the education system, K-12, as its own unique ecosystem. And all the different layers of management are all very important. And the first tier, second tier, third tier. So that's kind of cool. I think there's a paper to be written there, some sort of analogy about ecosystems in education. And just like, let's do not just more, but how can we do different? How can we be better? So these are all really hopeful and encouraging thoughts that are coming out of this really challenging situation that we had to step up to. And thank you for sharing.
No, of course. And I'll say too, in addition to, I know your background as a marine biologist, I also know I think your current title is Director of Education and Playful Learning. And I think the playful learning, it is, another thing I'd add in what we've learned is there's no mutual exclusivity between like kids having joy in school and actually high academic standards. And that I think is something that for so long, it was like kids are either can have fun in school or we could like teach them stuff. And it's just a false dichotomy. And so I do think as we're having this new infusion of investment to think about mental health resources, we're also encouraging the district to not think of mental health just as a psychiatric social worker, but like arts, that's a mental health support. Play is a mental health support. And I'm really excited because on the side, I'm a camp director of a nonprofit camp for underserved kids in LA, but we're doing basically summer camp. And so for parents who are listening, we have hundreds of schools this summer that are going to have 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. summer camp. Basically, you can show up and we have summer school options, but also just play, arts, STEAM, project-based learning, and just play. And so I hope parents will check that out because it's a really fun summer. I'm calling it kind of every kid every day, where every kid this summer will have a place to go every day and just be a kid.
That's what we're all about, right, Marcela? That is what we're all about.
Absolutely. Nick, I also wanted your take on, definitely there's blurred lines now that have evaporated between the schoolhouse and home, because, you're in my kitchen right now. And I watched my son, who's a teacher up in Salinas, and I could look over his shoulder at all of these kids in different places when he was teaching them online. So I saw parents and family members. So if you could talk a little bit about the opportunities that this presented of making more connection inadvertently with family during the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. And I remember, especially those first few weeks of distance learning, we had to kind of tell some parents nicely, like, don't go and unmute and say, oh, Johnny knows the answer. Because some parents were like so engaged that like they could hear the teacher, like, does anyone know the answer? And they'd be like, you do, raise your hand. It's like, parents, we still need a little separation. But I do think that it brought parents into the classroom, if you will, in a way that they haven't before. And I think it had two, sometimes complementary, sometimes oppositional impacts. One was, I think it made everyone appreciate how difficult the job of a teacher is. Also because parents, were also their kids' teachers. We didn't, especially last spring before we had really figured out what we were doing, not just LA, but everywhere. We know that I will say the quality of education was not as high as it should have been. So parents, we know, were doing a lot of supplemental work. But two, I think parents realized, like, they saw some incredible education and then they saw some like not so great teaching. And they saw that, oh, like my kids, I'm spending more time with my kids and I'm asking them about current events and they're not as aware as what's going on. And so I think it empowered parents in a way that like gave them new insight, especially kind of working parents and parents with fewer means who maybe didn't always have the time, not because they weren't interested, they didn't have the time to check in and ask their kids what they were learning. They kind of got to see it. And I'd like to think that one of the things that stays is this kind of parent engagement and understanding and pushing us, because I think that, I want parents to point out when they think our teachers and our school system needs to do better. But we also, have parents who reached out about like what an incredible and creative job teachers were doing. I also think that there are, as we think about the future of distance learning, there are some benefits that will last beyond COVID. One of those is just the access to coursework and enrichment. Not only like the enrichment, like summer enrichment, where we can do a lot more virtually than we were able to do before. And, so for Dr. Figueroa, like one of our classes is actually a partnership. Our summer enrichment class is a partnership with James Cameron. It's a marine biology theme. It's a Titanic themed marine biology course. And that's something that like we can offer online. We can offer it every summer. Like we can, another use case I think is for kids at smaller schools. Like if I really want to take AP, Japanese, but I don't have it at my school. Well, maybe there's a school across town that offers it and I can zoom into it. And another impact that just happened last week, which I think is cool, even if it's a less than ideal circumstance, is in my tenure on the board, my schools have probably lost 7 or 8 days to fires. And pre-pandemic, we've closed schools sometimes for a week, and we just said schools closed. Last week, I closed one elementary school, Topanga Canyon Elementary School, because of the Palisades fire. And instead of saying schools closed, we were able to say schools remote. And every kid, and so it was not a lost instructional day. It was just, we switched online. And so that, the way that some folks have snow days, it's unfortunate that LA has like wildfire days. But I do think that, when we do need to have school closures in the future, for snow days in some school districts, even though I know snow days are part of the fun of growing up in a cold weather climate, it was nice that we don't have to actually, not being physically in school doesn't mean learning is not happening. And I think that's something we'll take with us too.
I'm curious.
Go ahead, Mark.
I'm sorry. No, I've been reading about the state board decoupling test requirements from school districts and whatnot. But of course, as we return back to some state of normalcy, you have to expect that some of those same expectations will be put back in place. So I'm wondering how you're feeling about the creative changes that are taking place on the ground now, and how likely you're going to be able to sustain those when the expectations are that everybody's going to be trying to pass these high stakes tests and whatnot.
Yeah. I think it's been an unfortunate development in the last few years that like testing has become a dirty word or a dirty concept. But there's enough blame, if you will, to go around. I mean, part of that is because we have overcompensated and there's this drill and kill mentality. I mean, I think, a quick snapshot as I see it is like early 2000s, I think one of the things that the No Child Left Behind Act did right was, for the first time, we were assessing data and we were able to see these savage inequalities, in Jonathan Kozol's words, in subgroup performance. And we were able to see, I'll always think about, one of the few articulate phrases from George W. Bush was the soft bigotry of low expectations. And, we just held different kids to different standards. And the graduation requirements in Mississippi, for example, were equivalent to the eighth grade requirements in Massachusetts. So kids were graduating, So I think that calling that out and saying like, this is wrong. And when you disaggregate by subgroup, which NCLB required, you start to see, even in high performing schools, these huge gaps with students of color. That is important. And yet what happened, instead of saying, great, let's figure that out, it's like the pendulum swung. And now it's like every 5 minutes we're going to be testing. And I think the answer is somewhere in between. I'm a big believer in assessments and I was a middle school teacher. Like I need to know where my kids are at so I know how to meet their needs. And if I didn't assess and I just thought, oh, well, my kids are getting along and they like me, I'm patting myself on the back, I would be doing them a disservice. But if you only have a standardized test where you're not taking into account creativity on the teacher's front or student work product portfolios and joy, you've also missed the mark. And so I think that there are some really creative ways that teachers are assessing using the portfolio model. Now that requires resources, it requires more time. And I'm a big believer in building more time in the school day for teachers to lesson plan, collaborate, assess. We're actually, compared to high performing countries like Singapore or Norway, we actually have more instructional minutes, but less outcomes to show for it. And so what those countries do is they actually have more time for teachers to be professionals and collaborate and plan. So what I'd like us to see is a realization that, like, yes, we need to assess, and we need to have accountability, but that what that looks like needs to be more expansive, and I think that products need to be better, like the test and what we're using, and then how do you have ways to like norm school level or maybe neighborhood level around what those assessments look for. So I think, like maybe a Pollyannish answer, but I do think that like we do need to assess, and I think we need to, those of us who believe in testing need to also demand more from the tests, but we also, then need to convince those folks who think that testing is the enemy. There's actually real benefits, both in highlighting disaggregation and also letting teachers know whether they're doing a good job.
So I'm going to match your Pollyanna, and I'm going to borrow, and I'm going to take it up a level. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Marcela, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anne, who has a question. But Marcela's line would be, if I were queen of the world, and then if I were queen of the world, all that testing would be there, but it would be buried so deeply in games that the kids didn't know they were taking a test. That it was that we would get the assessment and we would get the information that we needed, but they wouldn't go through the anxiety that seems to have permeated that reality for most students. And
well, I think that's what it is, Leah, too, because, the idea that partially it became this dirty word because of the high stakes element. And it was bad, like, the idea that, and this was the other side of the NCLB coin, the pernicious side, that like, if you're doing worse, you get less resources, you get fewer resources,
right.
Opposed to you get more. I mean, but it was also that, you're not like, we should be building an assessment and have such fluency around that it just becomes, part of the vernacular, and kids know every day there's some sort of assessment.
It's going on behind the scenes. Right. And I know you had a question, and I know we're going to run out of time, so please.
I'll be real quick. Thank you. First of all, I agree with you on the assessment. I think where we went wrong is that assessment data became punitive rather than informative on where we need to go. So I appreciate you thinking on that. I think the other thing that we've learned in the last 18 months is that leadership really matters. And I do want to thank you for yours. But in listening to your comment, for example, about changing the face of high school and how high school junior and senior year might be different, how do you navigate those changes, the resistance to change? Because there have been people trying to change K-12 education for a very long time. And so working both with school leaders, with your community, with your fellow board members, how do you lead that change in challenging times? Any suggestions on that?
Yeah, no, it's something that I'm learning. And I do remember as a young teacher, right out of college, teaching in South LA and coming in being like, oh, I have all the answers. And the folks who had been there for 30 years were like, we thought we did too. Like, this is hard work. And if there were easy solutions, we would have thought of them a lot, sooner. So I think it's a few things. One, I think, is that we're always, this is paraphrasing, I think, something Bill Gates said, that like we overestimate what we can do in a year and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And so I think so much of this is thinking through like, oh, we got to change this right away, as opposed to what are the small changes that, when done right in the course of a decade, are actually going to lead to outcomes. And we've seen some of that in LA Unified. Charter schools are part of it, pilot schools, teacher-led schools. But one of my most innovative schools that I was at last week is an open charter magnet. And it's an LA Unified school that in 30 years ago started doing project-based learning and basically just letting educators guide what they wanted to do. And they literally tore down walls in between classrooms so that they could combine cohorts. And they don't have grades, they have clusters, purple cluster, silver cluster, yellow cluster. And they do like this project-based work. And it's, they were kind of ahead of its time. So I think part of it is empowering those who are closest to the work. We have been working hard at LA Unified to decentralize. We've broken up into 42 communities of schools. I think I always say I want to go from being a school system to a system of schools. And I think we need to think differently about the inversion model, like invert the model. So it shouldn't be that, oh, the school district in its central office gets all the money, and it should be the schools get the money. And almost, I'd love a world and I'm more radical than some, where like the schools get all the money and then they pay the district like an overhead fee for like transportation and food and legal. But really, like, we're just there in the back. I mean, the schools are the most important part of what we're trying to do. So I think it really is empowering educators. I do think it's investing. I mean, you know, there's been this perennial debate in California about, you know, does money matter? Like, no, it's outcomes. And I keep telling people, you know, yes, it's how you spend money, but the minute that like the private schools stop charging $50,000 a year, you can tell me money doesn't have anything to do with it. And so I do think this is an interesting time that we have this infusion of resources to think differently about it. Because I know, because I was an employee of the school district who got laid off year after year because of budget cuts. So I do think there haven't school districts, like there have been so many existential threats that they haven't had the leeway like to actually think creatively. So I think in abundance, you know, there's been a scarcity mentality in our public school systems where in abundance, we actually can think a little bit differently around, we can try something new.
So Nick, I want to, we're actually at 5:00 and normally it would be very easy for us to just go over a little bit, but tonight we have a board meeting that people have been joining us as we, and I wanted to, Brent Bushnell is the chairman of our board, and I know you're, you know, Brent, we would love to have you stay a minute or so and say hello to the board before we get started, if that works for you. So Dejana, do you want to say goodbye to our at-home audience, and we'll move right over there?
Absolutely. What an amazing conversation this has been. A huge thank you to Nick for joining us and being a part of this space right now. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, Mark. And of course, my colleague and dear friend, thank you, Leah. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next week for another live episode of Teachers for Teachers. That's all for now.
Thanks, everybody.